Welcome everybody. I'm going to sort of kick this off. I'm sure a few folks will be coming in, but I want to keep it sort of on time. My name is David Hart. I'm the director of the Mitchell Center, and I'm just going to say a little bit about, while these things are going by, some of which are directly related to this talk, by the way, just a little bit about Mac and Aram and how it is that I came to know them and what I know of the story that led to the great work they're going to be talking about today. So. Even from a distance, I knew before I got here about their work. They're extraordinary conservation biologists. They're well known around the country and around the world. They're amazing teachers and mentors. But I want to say a little bit about what I think of as their kind of remarkable leadership skills, especially in the work they'll be talking about today. So they both played key roles in laying the foundation for this stakeholder-engaged, solutions-driven interdisciplinary research that's underway at the Mitchell Center, across UMaine, as you'll hear, and increasingly spreading throughout the known universe. Aram certainly was at least on the front lines of this kind of work more than 20 years ago. There was something called the Vernal Pool Working Group in Maine that actually arose out of, let's just say, some disagreements between the federal and the state government about how to manage wetlands. Imagine the federal and state government not getting along. I know we can't picture that today, but back then things like that happened. And I don't think we should be surprised that she had that kind of interest when she was just a larva. A kid growing up in Rhode Island. She ran the Frog Patrol, and there's a wonderful story, if you haven't seen about her, a special feature in Science that appeared almost exactly this time a year ago called Pooling Resources, or if you want to hear that part of the story, go take a look at that. Mac, one of the things I remember about the key roles he played in helping us get things underway here is that he and Kathleen Bell facilitated what was a 2-hour discussion that we had in January of 2007 with Angus King, in between when he was governor and when he was senator, that he said he didn't really want to drive to campus, but he didn't mind getting on his iMac in his kitchen. And so I think his face was projected on the back of the wall in this room. And he basically spoke with us about, as we were brainstorming about how the University of Maine could become a more useful partner to the state in solving sustainability problems. And I know many of us in the Mitchell Center were so impressed with the kind of work that Aram and Mac were doing that one of the very first grants that we awarded out of the Mitchell Center back in 2007 was to help them expand their stakeholder-engaged interdisciplinary approach to these kinds of problems. And among other things, then they helped create the proposal we wrote to the National Science Foundation that was awarded a $20 million grant for the Sustainability Solutions Initiative. They went on to get another $1.5 million grant to continue this as with funding from the NSF Dynamics of Coupled Natural Human Systems program, and 2 more $6 million grants we've received to continue growing this capacity for problem solving. And I'm not quite sure how they'll tell this story, so let me tell my part. That I think the key lessons I've learned from Aram and Mac are, one, that the road to solutions is long and pretty winding at times. There are going to be formidable obstacles along the way, and so persistence is a key to making headway. And one of the things I've been impressed by, not just in the way they brought together researchers from many different fields, faculty and students, but also many different kinds of stakeholder partners, including what might be viewed as strange bedfellows, sort of potential adversarial relationships that they've built into productive relationships, that's a key to doing this great work. And I will say that it's quite appropriate that they talk about this in the Mitchell Center, where Senator Mitchell's life has been often about forging those kinds of partnerships. So I'll turn it over to them.
It's I was thinking about the sort of arc of this talk. This will be the 5th time we've given this talk, and we started about as far away as you can get with a couple of talks in Australia, and then Montpellier, France, for the Conservation Biology Congress, and earlier this year in Montreal, and finally we're home. So that's kind of fun. What I'm going to be describing is, for most of my time here, is sort of the intellectual foundation for one of the grants that David mentioned, the the NSF coupled natural humans proposal that a bunch of us were involved in, not just around myself, and several other faculty and a bunch of graduate students and such are all involved in. How we came to put that together and sort of, again, the intellectual foundations. It begins with this photograph. Does anyone in the room besides Lindsay know what this is a picture of? David? No? Anyone else? So this is a purple sea star, famous in ecological circles from the 1960s when Bob Payne out at University of Washington referred to these as keystone predators because of their roles in structuring intertidal communities. And the keystone predator idea started in the 1960s, but it didn't really take off. And so here's that keystone idea of a species that has greater importance than in an ecosystem than you might otherwise predict based on its abundance. The idea has expanded greatly. My favorite example are beavers, which are sometimes people use the word keystone engineers because of these entire small ecosystems that they create with impacts on lots and lots of species. At some point in the 1980s, it felt like the keystone idea sort of went off the rails for a bit. There was a point where people as esteemed as E.O. Wilson were talking about kelp in a kelp forest as a keystone species, and it had become sort of synonymous with just ecologically important, but really that's not the essence. And various essays written in the 1990s brought us back to this fundamental idea of something that has ecological importance that's disproportionate to its size or abundance or some metric like that. So keystones is going to be a key idea in this talk. People were talking about keystones a lot at roughly the same time that biodiversity entered our vocabulary in the 1980s. This photograph captures nicely why biodiversity intrigues us so, but it also captures a bit of a problem. We say that we care about all species and genes and ecosystems, etc., but most of our information and understanding is very much focused on bird animals and vascular plants. The large majority of species, things like this, we know nothing about. We're lucky if we can identify them. In many cases, we're dealing with species that haven't even been described by science. And this is a significant problem if you claim you're trying to save biodiversity and you can't even list what you're actually trying to do. So it was in response to that the coarse filter approach to conservation was developed largely in the late 80s, early 90s. The idea was that if we protect the representative array of ecosystems here, lowland forest in the Congo Basin, that we will save not only the conspicuous things like okapis and hornbills and guenon monkeys, etc., but lots and lots of species that are present in this picture, microbes, invertebrates, etc., that we don't even are unable to really document them, but they're there, and if we do a good job of representative ecosystem protection, they will be protected. The coarse filter approach always does need to be married to a fine filter, species-specific approach. There will always be some species, particularly those subject to overexploitation, like pygmy chimpanzees and Congo peacock, for which we will need sort of species-targeted protection. But the concept is that the largest suite of species will be sufficient to protect these larger ecosystems. Now, for quite some time now, I've been interested in sort of the marriage of these two ideas between coarse filter conservation and the keystone concept, with the idea of trying to protect keystone elements within ecosystems that might have larger importance than you would predict by their size. I call this mesofilter conservation in the first essay on this topic, but it's finally dawned on me that mesofilter conservation is really insider's baseball. The words are not intuitively obvious to the average person on the street, and so starting with the writing of this proposal, we called it Small Natural Features. We'll basically, I'll come back to talk about what each of those words mean in a moment, but let me sort of illustrate the concept with some examples now. Perhaps the easiest example is imagining a desert spring. It's going to have an aquatic ecosystem associated particularly with it that is likely to be absent from much of the surrounding landscape, and by providing a really limited resource like water, and where you might have birds, mammals, insects coming in from significant distances to take advantage of this resource, it's going to have an impact stretching far, far beyond the boundaries of the spring itself. This idea of limited resources, features that could provide limited resources, takes many forms. In the temporary pools that Aram will talk about later, it's simply having water that is free of predators. Water that, because it's temporary, dries up part of the year, doesn't support fish, and thus fairy shrimp and amphibians and other things can live there. Caves are a great example of this sort of special environments. They both special and often protective, relatively stable in environments, and supporting a unique biota, as we know. And in some cases, particularly those caves that support large bat populations, having ecological impacts that spread for, in some cases, literally thousands of square kilometers around some of the largest caves of these Brazilian free-tailed bats, are impacted in terms of from both an ecological perspective and an economic one, in terms of the role that these bats play in terms of agricultural pests. Rock outcrops are a neat example. The hard substrate and with cracks and fissures and such represent juxtaposed against gravity and the inability of deer to scale that thing and eat plants off the face of it, or in other animals. Various reptiles and vertebrates, birds and such take advantage of places like this. These particular limestone cliffs in Ottawa have a large and endemic fauna of mollusks associated with them. Sort of analogous to them, underwater, if you have a rocky substrate, particularly one like this coral reef with lots of niches and cracks and places for things to hide away from predators, sitting in the middle of a vast bed of sediments, you can have quite extraordinary abundance and diversity of species taking advantage of this predator-free environment. Large old trees are an example of this. The big trees, ones big enough to have cavities in them, big enough to have deep fissures in their bark, end up supporting species that require cavities to nest in. Species of lichens and insects occur in the barks of these trees that are not on younger trees. So big old trees constitute a small natural feature. In agricultural landscapes, the vegetation doesn't have to be very old to be very valuable. Often it is old. These hedgerows might well be centuries old, but simply having remnant vegetation patches in settings like this make quite an impact on the local flora and fauna. Riparian zones are really a classic example of this phenomenon. They, from the terrestrial perspective, they represent access to water. From the aquatic perspective, they represent access to a substrate. They're widely recognized as, in terms of their importance from water quality, recreation, wildlife habitat, all those sorts of features are well known. We don't often think of them as small because they tend to be long and linear, but if you think in terms of their footprint on a larger landscape, they really often are quite a small portion of the overall landscape and have way more importance than you would predict based on that percentage. And there are specialized versions of riparian zones, these dry temporary riverbeds that I've learned a lot about in the last year that are common in arid regions and support aquatic features living down in the hyporeaic zone out of sight in a photograph like this. So I've given you sort of a cook's tour of what were originally a bunch of talks at this Conservation Biology Congress in France last year. Currently, all case studies submitted to a special issue of Conservation Biology. 30 authors, roughly from 10 different countries, are contributing to all this. Each one of them are answering for these different systems. What are they? Why are they important? What are the management challenges? How can they be conserved? These case studies are sandwiched between 3 other papers as an introduction where we go into a great deal of detail about how we came to choose these 3 words. Small natural feature. You'd be surprised how long, maybe you wouldn't, you're mostly academics, you know how we can talk about anything forever. But we spent a lot of time in France talking about each one of these words. Small is a bit challenging because small when you're talking about the ocean isn't small when you're talking about a forested watershed or something like that. But for the most part, we're talking about features that are measured in fractions of a hectare or a few hectares, having influences over things you would measure in kilometers or up to thousands of square kilometers. Natural became a bit of a challenge. We had a lot of Europeans as part of the group, and much of Europe, there's not much natural left in large portions, and so we had to embrace things like hedgerows going across landscapes that haven't been natural in any way that would make sense to us here in this room, perhaps for centuries. We did reject, there were people making strong claims, and this would have been challenging, to include abandoned buildings as small natural features. And we drew the line on buildings, but we did accept some things that are clearly human-made, like hedgerows. Feature, even that word. Basically, we decided to go for things that you can map. There were people making arguments that we should treat herds of caribou as a feature, but one obviously that moves about. We have a couple syntheses. Synthetics paper, Dana Bauer from Clark University and 3 Mainers have produced a paper on this, and there's an overall synthesis with a bunch of us. One of the things that comes out most strongly in these syntheses is the extent to which the small scale of these features means that we're often working with individual landowners, and that's rather different than much of conservation, particularly conservation that we tend to think of landscape scale conservation nowadays, and most parts of the world that means dealing with lots and lots and lots of people. But in some cases you can deal with at least individual small natural features and talk to one person who owns one or more. I'm going to give you a little bit of a real flying overview of some of the synthesis. We ended up talking a lot about how to categorize conservation activities. We ended up with 6 basic types of activities, put into a matrix where we recognize the distinction between conservation that happens incidentally to other sorts of activities. How sometimes small natural features get protected just because of where they happen to be juxtaposed against other large-scale conservation activities. Activities that are undertaken on a voluntary basis, and then sort of a carrot and stick incentive-based things versus those where we end up with laws that restrict what people can do. So some quick examples of these. Education turns out to be surprisingly important across these realms. Many times these things are not appreciated. Their ecological values and such are not fully appreciated. And sometimes it can happen incidentally. Millions of people visit caves every year. Imagine if every person who ever gets a tour of a cave listens to 5 minutes about bats and their impact on the larger ecological landscape rather than just how stalactites and stalagmites are formed. Inventory is very important. A lot of these features are not apparent in remote sensing imagery, so just simply getting people out on the ground looking for these things is surprisingly important across a bunch of the different features. And in lots of cases, we need more information about their actual values, who's using them for what. This is there's a large effort to do this with desert springs in Australia now using camera traps. Any guesses what this guy's trying to inventory? A skink, or a rare skink that's associated with boulders like this in Australia again. Protection. Sometimes it's pretty straightforward with small features. You can even put a fence up around them, and this has actually been done for a surprising number of large old trees in various parts of the world. I could found dozens of pictures like this of individual old trees that have been protected. This is the entrance to a bat cave. Sometimes it's as simple as putting up a gate and keeping out the cavers that would disturb a bat colony. Sometimes it interfaces clearly with conservation at larger scales. When we do the typical sort of landscape planning, designing of protected areas, we can look for concentrations of these small natural features, and that may well inform the patterns by which we pursue things at the more typical scales of conservation. Sustainably managed. Some of these features are things that we can actually use, and if we do so in a wise, sustainable way, then that's all to the good. A sort of an extreme example is large old trees. Well, big old trees can become timber, and it's not necessarily a terrible thing to cut a big tree. Indeed, much could be said for trying to create markets for big old trees so that people have incentives to have more of them on the landscape. The most extreme example of this comes from the Alps of Germany and Austria, where there are stands that are planned. This is not just sort of incidental. They actually plan out which stands to harvest after 300-year rotations to produce the finest spruce for making biolands. A more common example would involve temporary wetlands like these prairie potholes out on the prairies here, and here and for a number of these features, management of grazing. How can we manage grazing systems in a way that sustains the ecological values that we find in these systems? Restoration is pretty straightforward. Lots of examples of that, particularly with riparian zones, often in many cases coming with a restrictive component where somebody's done something bad somewhere else and they are forced by government laws to do something good in terms of restoring a degraded riparian system. And create. There are a number of these systems that are not really very feasible to create, but there are some cases that make sense. And artificial water holes for large mammals in arid regions. There's various controversial aspects of this, but there are certainly times and places where you would say this is the logical thing to do. So. Sort of an extreme case of conservation activities, but there are examples where it makes sense. So wrapping up things, again, I want to emphasize that one of the neat things about this small natural features approach to things is that one can often be dealing with individual landowners and accomplish a lot. It often means scaling from all forms of government, from right down to municipalities. There are 722 local governments in Australia, 6 states, and one national government, of course. And these activities play out well at all 3 levels of government. And you'll hear a nice example of that from Aram right about now as I...
Why don't you do it? So what I'm going to talk about today is I'm going to go into sort of the example that we gave overseas of one small natural feature, which in Maine happens to be vernal pools. But before I do that, I would like to give you some examples of other small natural features around the world that are temporary wetlands, which is what our contribution was for temporary wetlands, and end with an innovative mechanism that has just been signed into the Army Corps regional permit. So that's what we'll end with. So temporary wetlands, I don't really like the term because they're not really temporary even when they're dry. But the focus of temporary wetlands, as you can tell from that, is the hydro period. So these are wetlands that lose water at some time during the year, or they may lose water every 5 years, or they may only have water every 20 years. It's very variable. But as you can see from here, the hydrologic functions of these wetlands is very diverse. They're not as simple as people once thought, and Andy Reeve helps contribute to this confusion of discharge and recharge and what they're doing. So Andy has a student who is working on vernal pool hydrology right now, Kelly Straka, so we're learning more about that. So the key thing, even around the world, is that these things lose water at some part of the time during the year, and as Mac had suggested earlier, that changes predatory animals, and you get rid of a lot of vertebrate predators. You still have some invertebrate predators. Ephemeral ponds is what they call them in Europe, in Australia. Prairie potholes in North America, which includes obviously Canada. We know that, right? And playa or dry lakes, and these are ones which may have water very infrequently. These are all types of small natural features that are temporary wetlands. Gilgays or hog wallow landscapes. And I'm not going to go into this now because it's not the purpose of this talk, but some of the functions and some of the contributions that these things make beyond their small footprint is incredible productivity. When you have any ecosystem with a fluctuating water regime of anoxic and oxic conditions, you get a highly productive system. So high productivity, specialized breeding habitat for invertebrates or vertebrates or plants too, depending on where you are in the country. Some endemic species, particularly in California vernal pools and some of the drier European pools. And so the focus is going to be on what did we do to help conserve the small natural feature in Maine, which is vernal pools. Our vernal pools, as many of you know, are dominated by the functions that they have for amphibian breeding habitat. So the talk is in 3 sections. We're going to talk about the pools, the SNFI, small natural feature, the policy, which was our challenge, and the people, which turned out to be our solution. So pool characteristics for this audience, I see a lot of people who work in vernal pools, but there may be some folks who don't live and breathe vernal pools, so we'll give a really quick summary. They're generally small. In Maine, most of the vernal pools are less than 4,300 square feet, which conveniently is the allowable fill without a permit. They have no permanent inlet or outlet. They're fishless and specialized for breeding for certain animals, including the fairy shrimp, the wood frog, spotted salamander, and blue spotted salamander. The policy that we currently have is 2 levels, federal and state. The federal policy is very confusing to people, as is the state. It will protect 750 feet from a certain type of vernal pool as long as that vernal pool is deemed to have a hydrologic connection to an open water body, or to be adjacent, which is defined by the Supreme Court. So there have been issues with this, and the federal pools don't always match the state pools that are regulated. The state regulation will issue a permit within 250 feet of a pool, and for every landowner around that pool, you get your own quarter of a vernal pool, even if it's the same one. So although these regulations have been a big benefit in that they get vernal pools literally on the map, and the public paying enough attention to them to be upset to want to do something else, this has been a good thing, and it is a good default. So although the regulations have some drawbacks because they were politically defined as well as ecologically, without them, we wouldn't be making any progress. So I'm not throwing those out the window. I'm just saying this gave us a good impetus for moving forward. So if we go by the current federal and state regulations in our Army Corps Region 1, we might end up with ghost pools, which means that the post-breeding habitat is very important to those pool breeding amphibians that I just flipped up on the chart there. Many of them travel more than 750 feet in their life history. They hibernate in the upland. They spend only 2 weeks or so in the vernal pool itself. So we're not sure how fragmented it can be before those pools are not actually functioning for the major function that we look to them to do, which is being this breeding habitat and exporting carbon and all of the other functions associated with pools and their hydrologic functions and their biogeochemical functions. So the challenges that we were facing is they're hard to inventory, as Mac alluded to, very hard to find on aerial photos in our region. Regulation includes the pool plus the forest, and wetland regulation by itself is problematic, so try saying to someone you also have to conserve X amount of land around that pool. So that's been hard. The majority of them are on private property, and there are no evident ecosystem services, and that's what the social scientists like Kathleen Bell and Dana Bauer and Eric Nelson are all working on vis-a-vis vernal pools to help fill in those blanks. So our solution has been to change this paradigm. A lot of landowners are terrified of the vernal pool regulations, and they see it as a takings of their private property rights. And frogs become much larger in their minds than they actually are. So what we would like to do is change that paradigm to make frogs once again small, not such a threat, and to work with municipalities to have landscapes that are both ecologically and economically viable. And that has been the goal as the next step forward post the regulations. The state regulation kicked in 2007, and there was plenty of time for uproar and upset and bills in the state legislature to turn over the regulation for us to get people interested in helping to solve this problem. So Mac and myself and Mike Kinnison and Cindy Lofton and Andy Reeve and Aria, is Amarbot, where are you, Aria there, have a suite of graduate students who are working on biophysical issues with vernal pools, hydrology, and biogeochemistry, which will help feed into what ecosystem services are. So we're focusing on vernal pools and humid-dominated landscapes. And this is just one example from Tom Hastings and Mitchell Jones' work, trying to give more information to local landowners about what habitats frogs are using post-breeding in an urbanizing development. And all of these lines are different trajectories of wood frogs that Tom and Mitchell have been following around, and Mitchell is now, Thomas is now following around until hibernation, so that what the landowners want is they want to know how much and of what kind of habitat do you want to conserve. Instead of putting blank circles around them and saying we need all of this, maybe we can fine tune it and see how that goes. So our goal is to have the research marching with policy development. So we keep on doing the research, but it doesn't stop us developing new policies. We just hope that we're getting it somewhat right, and we keep fine-tuning it. And that's really the best way to go. If you wait until you have all the answers, it's probably too late. So the tried but not true is a traditional top-down regulation. It gets it on the map, but ecologically it will not carry the day when all is said and done and we develop everything around 250-foot circles. Incidental work sometimes, as Mac was saying, this is one activity. You can get some land trusts that happen to have vernal pools in them, or big pieces of land that happen to have vernal pools. Voluntary works in some realms and not others. It works really well with the forest industry. We developed habitat management guidelines for forestry, and forestry is a soft landing for frogs. Trees come back, and major companies have been adopting the best habitat management guidelines, and we find that that's not really the current major threat to vulnerable amphibians. So that works. We tried voluntary best development practices. Doesn't work so well when you need to put your kid to college and you want to sell off a piece of land that has a vernal pool on it, and suddenly everyone's regulating everything around that. It doesn't work if you were planning on that land for retirement. So voluntary did not work out for that. So that's why we decided to do a new approach that would be locally driven, using local intelligence, which comes in really well when we know that photo interpretation of vernal pools is very poor. You wouldn't believe the number of people know where the wet spots are in their neighborhoods, where the frogs are calling. And if they see some benefit to that, they'll actually help you with that. So local intelligence has been amazing. Nothing like giving people ownership of how the land in their town is going to be used to have them pay attention, rather than perceiving someone far off in the federal government or the state government telling them what to do. And with that comes a lot of flexibility. So they help develop what the solution is, and we built flexibility into it, and people really appreciate that. So what we did is we built off of a vernal pool mapping program that started in the middle 2000s with all of these towns. So using citizen scientists, we mapped all of the vernal pools where we had landowner permission that were remotely identified, and that misses about 30%, but at least for each of these towns up here, we have a database, a GIS database with potential vernal pools, and then with ones that the citizen scientists have documented, and we've assessed egg mass numbers and know which ones are state significance and so forth. So what we decided to do is select town leaders who seemed very engaged and proactive and who had a really good reputation in the state. So we started working with Evan Rickert in Orono because he's well known in the state. And then we chose a completely different town in southern Maine where there's a lot more development pressure and a very strong development community and a fantastic proactive planning department, Topsy. So we decided the best way to export what we do with these two towns is to have a model program show success in those towns and hope that some of the other towns would want to continue on with us. So we had an idea about how we might do this at the local level, or at least about who we needed to invite to the table. So we got a stakeholder group together 6 years ago, over 70 meetings with greater than 25 stakeholders there were more stakeholders, but 25 or more regularly came. And during this time, it started as broad as what can we do that is different from what the state is doing and puts it back in local control. And we discovered that there's something called delegated authority where the state DEP can give a town authority for managing any natural resource that it wants to take over. So we thought, why not vernal pools? The Army Corps was also at that table, and they said, out west we have something called a special area management plan, and it's never been done in the east before, but it works when advocacy groups get together and they're worried about a resource that's disappearing. So the Army Corps thought that might work here. So that's what we worked on. We said, well, let's develop a vernal pool special area management plan that is locally driven and see if we can make that work. So these were the people that we invited to the table and who came regularly. The key is in red because us biophysical people, we work a lot with ourselves and with regulators, but we don't invite the economists and the developers, our real estate appraisers. All those folks were involved as well. And probably could have been done sooner than 6 years if you haven't engaged all the people who might, have been at the other end of the podium during hearings. But when you draw all these people in, there was lots of interesting discussion, and this has actually been the favorite thing I've ever done in my entire career, was working with people who were not biophysical scientists. So Vanessa Levesque was a PhD student, and she studied both the economics and the process for her dissertation, and she has now published her work. So there's an interesting paper on turning contention into collaboration, and she did some quantitative statistics to look at how our process was, and we were hoping that other folks working on contentious issues might try to emulate the process, because it was an interesting process we don't have time to get into here today. So what I want to end with is just talk about the special area management plan and what went into it. So its goal was to streamline development in designated growth areas. This has to be done in a town that already has a comprehensive plan, and so they've designated growth in rural areas, but we're taking a subset of that growth area that is determined by the town and by town vote where the SAMP will be able to be applied. It compensates rural landowners that agree to conserve the amount of post-breeding and hibernating habitat that you actually need for long-term maintenance of pool-breeding amphibians, not just a little circle, but something that's actually based on the current science. So what we're hoping the endpoint of this is to conserve the resource and invite growth into towns. And this is why the developers actually developed the fee mechanism and push forward with this, because they see a real benefit to themselves of having a town they can go into that has a designated growth area where they no longer have to get state and federal for permits to impact vernal pools. And that really is the key. So we wrote the vernal pool SAMP. It got sent out on the Federal Register for public notice. We dealt with lots of comments coming in, ranging from people who wanted it to be completely rejected to people who supported it. We took about a month to answer all the comments and have public hearings. Finally, it went back to the Army Corps, and they signed it, and our main DEP, working with the Army Corps, signed it on September 6th, which was really good news because we got an EPA grant for 2 years to implement the SAMP before we knew it was going to be signed. We were really thinking it would be. So we have 2 years to implement that in our 2 towns. So I want just to tell you a little bit more about how it works. The growth area is designated, a pool is impacted, and that means that they don't get a permit if they elect to do the SAMP. They don't have to get a permit. They can fill the pool, they can build right up to the pool, and I found myself having to argue with Maine Department of Inland Fisheries and Wildlife and EPA. Here I am, a vernal pool ecologist, saying, nah, we don't need those pools. It's fine. In the long term, it's going to be a better outcome. And I had to argue that hard, and Carly Eakin's work, and Lydia Kiffner, who's not here right now, their work on biogeochemistry and on effects of urbanization on vernal pool amphibians hopefully will help inform that in the long term these pools probably aren't sustainable. And I actually fundamentally believe that they are not. In Massachusetts, you can't say, well, look what happened to Massachusetts, but they have little circles of 100 feet around their pools and no more pool breeding amphibians in some of their certified pools. So we're pretty certain that this is not a good situation. What we got in return is 2 pools in the growth area with much more post-breeding habitat, which is flexible, but it is greater than what the Army Corps requires for mitigation as it is. So, and we also got flexibility that it doesn't have to be circles. It could be based off of Tom's work. What does the corridor look like? What do they need? And so I am convinced that the growth area, the definition of it is build it out. That's what a growth area is. So I'm convinced that that money that we're taking in the fee from the developers and remunerating the local landowners will be a win-win situation for the economics and for the pools. It also has incentivized, what Orono is doing is sending out postcards to all its rural and landowners that didn't give permission to visit their pools and say, hey, we have this new program where you could be paid for conserving your pool. Are you interested? And we're expecting to be able to survey a lot more pools once that goes out, because it actually addresses some of the landowner concerns. Kathleen Bell and her graduate students actually worked with the developers to work out the fee mechanism and to figure out the value, so what the fee mechanism is, it takes a percentage of the value of your growth lot with and without a vernal pool. It takes the difference, which is huge, and takes a percentage of that to pay the rural landowner. And we developed a bunch of conservation criteria for picking out the rural pools which would be eligible for this process. And the land trusts are engaged because a lot of the pools that popped out as of conservation interest are also on their lands of interest for gaining, for greenways. So we're working with the land trusts, and they're seeing the development fees as seed money for some of their projects. So that is a complete local win. So here's a growth area where we take one pool and then we replace it in an area like this, where we know we have some long-term conservation. The other thing that we're doing is some towns like Topsom and Brunswick. Topsom is really built out. Brunswick is adjacent and has a lot of rural land. We're scaling this up to be between towns, and some land trusts go beyond one town. So you can play this game, this fee game, in an adjacent town or whatever a land trust has for land. And we're hoping to go regional at some point. So the current option for a developer is to pay an in lieu fee to the state. But that in lieu fee will buy more vernal pools, but it could be in Aroostook County for something happening in Orono. So that works with a lot of money in big projects, but the towns also like the fact that the conservation would happen nearby and not the dollars won't be sent off to some other part of the state. So it's a good complement to the main in lieu fee. This is a local in lieu fee. So we have all of the maps we've done, applied all the conservation criteria to the two towns. So Topsom now has a GIS map. There's different colors telling you different things about the pools. And this will be used as the base for picking out, if you look in the rural area in those colors, we've run them through the criteria, and we're going to use this as a base for figuring out where do we start our first deals. And the really interesting thing is there's a developer who worked with us in Topsom who is an entrepreneur, and he's decided to run around New England buying up vernal pool landscapes as a vernal pool mitigation bank before they're compromised by development. So that's a really interesting idea, and if this person has the money to do that, that means that in some of the more developed areas there would be a nice pool of mitigation sites ahead of time. And then here's the map for Orono. I won't let you look at it too long. So one of the things that we're doing for publicizing this is we have a web page associated with the NSF grant that highlights the research and also our citizen science programs, but we will have a page on the vernal pool SAMP and the towns who are participating, and follow it along and see how it works out, which hopefully will be positively. And we have a lot of people to thank for all of the research that's been done to support the stages that we were working on. We have written into the vernal pool SAMP that every year it's going to be revisited and updated based on the science, and the towns are liking that. The Army Corps, everyone likes that for adaptive management. In case it doesn't work, we can even tweak the mechanism, the fee mechanism, and the developers have agreed to that. So we'll have an annual check-in to make sure we're not ruining all the vernal pools in Maine without anything happening on the other end. So that's a good thing. Lots of funding and support from all sorts of people. Want to point out Ruth Ladd from the Army Corps and Mike Mullen and Philip de Maynadier. Without the support of those agencies, they could have killed it at any time. It really is all about who the personalities are in charge, and we were really lucky to be able to work with these open-minded people to get something as sort of risky and new accepted like this. And this is it's not a mandatory, it's a mitigation tool. It's another tool in the toolbox that is now available to all of Region 1, which is New England and I think New York, I'm not sure. But it's those folks who actually helped us to make that happen. So I think Mac and I, we have time for questions for both Mac and myself. Anyone has any questions? What's that? Steve Coughlin.
Aram Calhoun, thank you very much. Could you go back to one of your maps of showing the growth versus the no growth zones?
Yes.
Doesn't matter which one.
Yep.
So assuming, let's say, we follow this to the logical conclusion that growth eventually eats up all potential space and resources until it's limited by something, what happens when all the areas for growth have been developed and now there's pressure to keep on growing into the protected areas? What happens then?
Right. It's a good question. And this map doesn't show it, but we were worried about growth areas being so big. So we actually have a designated growth area for the SAMP, which is infill to start with. We're starting very conservative. So it would be an infill area. But to answer your question, there is nothing to stop a town from revisiting its comprehensive plan. I think they're done every 5 or 10 years, and they can revisit it and they can expand their growth area. All the more reason to implement this program now and because it's in perpetuity. What we get conserved by the land trust and by this program is conserved in perpetuity.
So that eventually growth would have to stop once all of the land that's not protected. Oh, okay.
Yeah, yes, and we do know that if it isn't protected, it will be developed. And so that's sort of, I think in such a rural state as Maine is, I think we can get ahead of the 8 ball that way. Because we all the towns, no matter who they are, if they have a comprehensive plan, they have a growth area. And we can work within that growth area and get money that we couldn't get otherwise. I mean, we don't get the money when they do mitigation and usually what they do is they impact the pool because it's in a growth area, and then they pay a fee and we dig a hole that becomes a little green frog pond and we call it good. That's how it works. And now we're doing something constructive with the money.
So it's fair to say, though, that if the regulations stay in place, eventually this would limit growth in a particular township.
If the current regulations stay in place, you will have little pools with development all around them everywhere.
No, I mean these regulations here that you're proposing.
This is a mitigation tool.
Eventually.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's in
Great.
perpetuity. And that's why the land trusts are excited, because they can get more seed money and we can do swaths. And a lot of people that live in Maine because they like the juxtaposition of the rural lifestyle with some amenities. So we're hoping to do that on a town-by-town basis. So you don't just have to go to northern Maine to see trees. Yes.
What happens when someone wants to develop in the growth area on the border, and right adjacent to it is a rural area that meets the criteria, like at the very northwest or
So you're saying, what if someone in the growth area wants to develop and it's close to a rural pool that's in a rural area? That pool would not have met the conservation criteria because it needs to be embedded in a certain amount of undeveloped land.
So I mean like that purple spot right at the very top left of this image, right next to the border.
Yes.
But that's in the rural area, but it's still really close to the growth area.
Right. And I'm saying that
So it
pool
would be
wouldn't have made it through the filter if it didn't have the adjacent land. But, so if there were going to be a conservation deal, it would have to cover over into that other zone. Dan?
I'm going to let Mac off the hook here. You take all the heat away.
Yeah.
So Mac, I've got a little heartburn over the idea of small. And rather than a feature that's going to scale with the ecosystem process that one is attempting to conserve. For example, I can think of the Arctic National Wildlife Area, which is thousands of square kilometers influencing, and yet it's small relative to the landscape of the caribou that might move 1,500 kilometers to swamp predators to get away from mosquitoes and then export carbons and affect browsing and plant diversity across, tens of thousands of square kilometers. As being a significant natural feature that's disproportionate in its importance relative to the size of the landscape it influences. And I can think of a single tree which might harbor a honeybee nest as being important to ecology and fibers and pollination to an area that might scale much larger to it. And to me, they're serving the same function, but one is small and the other is huge.
Yeah, so certainly we would start at the small one. The tree would fit our paradigm, and the question becomes, how big does it? Where do you cut off the upper limit? And I would say it's really when the conventional tools of landscape scale conservation come to the fore. Then when you're dealing with the kind of area where you could imagine putting a protected area around it, or creating a set of zoning rules or something. When it's big enough to do that, then it's called conventional conservation. Mm-hmm. If it's smaller than that, where it doesn't make sense to go out and buy a chunk of land and put up Harrison's Nature Preserve signs around it, if it's small enough, then it fits this paradigm that we're advocating here. So it's sort of a practical, and exactly where you draw that line is definitely different depending on where you are. Very different from if you're looking at an agricultural landscape in Germany. As two of the last case studies that came through the door just last week. One was dealing with the marine realm, and a woman from New Zealand was talking about coral reefs that are, in some cases, many square kilometers in size, but influencing entire seas, as making sense in her context, where when Obama goes and creates a marine protected area of the marine realm, it's maybe thousands of square kilometers. So it sort of has to scale a bit to the setting, but ultimately I think it's really where you pass that threshold into more conventional landscape scale.
I think I'm kind of caught up on the keystone aspect of something just being worth conserving regardless of its size due to the landscape feature or suite of features having a disproportionate effect relative to their size in terms of the area of influence. Both, I guess, relevant for conservation by different mechanisms.
Yeah, I mean, you know, that maybe the ultimate scale would be, we could talk about people talk about the Amazon basin being a keystone biome in a global climate system. So, you know, it works at all different scales.
We tend to think of it as something that a regular landowner could own the whole thing, not a corporate, timber owner, but a regular landowner. It's possible that they could own an entire natural feature, which makes it difficult to conserve when it's scattered about by many different landowners.
One more, we're almost at 4 o'clock.
Yes, we have. Any other questions? Okay, well, thank you.